Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and today we're going to be continuing our prediction series, and we're going to be focusing on contract extensions for the 2024 offseason. So, we're going to talk about a lot of players in this video. I've got 14 I want to hit on. It's not every single player that would currently be a free agent for Jacksonville, but it's the players I think that are worth noting, and that does include some guys who maybe aren't starters, more of special teamers, but I think people are still notable enough to discuss. So we're going to focus on that, and I want to note before we jump into our first guy as well, if a player is noted as free agency in this does not 100% mean that they would not return this scenario. I do think there are certain players that probably just don't get signed until they hit free agency. I think that's likely for probably at least 5 or 6 of these guys, maybe more. And some of the guys I have extending with the team, maybe they get signed a little into free agency, but those are ones that I'm more confident in returning to Jacksonville. So, with that all said, let's hop into this. We're going to be going kind of same order as before. So, we'll go through the offense, working our way to the trenches, and then on defense, we'll work our way from the trenches back to the secondary. So, our first guy to talk about, D'Ernest Johnson. I think that D'Ernest Johnson is going to return to Jacksonville. I don't see much reason for him not to. I thought he played well when he was out on the field. I think they noticed that, and there's a reason why they brought him in last year. You know, when you look back at D'Ernest Johnson's career, especially if you're a fantasy football player or had him on your team a couple years back when he'd randomly start for Cleveland, this is a guy that when he goes on the field and has to step up for the team, he does a really damn good job. He's had some 100-yard games when he's been forced into that situation. And so you like having him on the team as a backup option because it's extremely affordable and you have that immense upside with him as a player. So I don't really see a reason why you can't bring him back for a similar value, especially because last year he didn't really do anything that was like, out of this world or was going to drive up his contract value. So I think you can bring him back for just a little over the veteran minimum, solidify your running back room, and feel good about your 3 guys going forward, especially if you improve the offensive line. So that's my expectation with Ernest Johnson. I think he will return to Jacksonville. It won't shock me too much if he walks, but this is my expectation for what happens with him. Now our next guy, I think an even easier decision here. So Tim Jones. I think Tim Jones is definitely going to return because he is an ERFA. So ERFAs are players that are usually kind of in their rookie contract. Maybe they've been released at a point or they were a UDFA at one point. And so the teams get options on whether or not they want to keep them for the next season. I think this usually goes through 3 years. So like, for example, I'm pretty sure James Robinson would have been an example of one of these players. And so the contract is extremely cheap for Jacksonville. It's under $1 million, and it's simply just an option of whether they want to take that or not. So Tim Jones is not really out here with the ability to negotiate like a bigger contract than this, not that he would be able to anyway. So it's a question of would you take back Tim Jones, who is a solid backup for you, not the best, right? But solid backup, can make wide receiver room for less than what the veteran minimum is for most players. Yeah, absolutely. You're going to take that deal. That's the guy they like. He's earned his spot on the team. He's a hard worker. He's going to fit in Jacksonville going forward. So I think Tim Jones, another example of a player who's returning. Now for our next guy. Guy I do not think will be coming back to the team is Jamal Agnew. And maybe this is one that later in the offseason could come to fruition. Maybe he could come back on a cheaper deal. But for Jamal Agnew, there's a few issues. I think he was good on offense when he was used by the team. He had some explosive plays. That's something he's done throughout his contract. But you look at the last 2 years, he hasn't returned a single touchdown in that entire time. And that's what they're paying him to do. And sure, like you've got a play against Tennessee that was held back where they called a holding penalty where he would have returned it all the way. He had the explosions in the playoffs back in 2022. He's had his moments, but I don't think it's good enough to justify around what he was earning. And usually when you're talking about pay cuts for a player or you want to offer them less than what the contract was before, a lot of the time those players hit free agency, test out the market, and then maybe come back later in the offseason. So I think that's probably going to be the case with Jamal Agnew, just because he really didn't do enough the last couple of years, I feel like, to earn another contract with the Jaguars at the value he was earning. So this is usually the way that these kind of things go. So that's my stance on him. I think he's probably the first person in this video that would probably end up hitting the market. Now, next person, we're going to keep with a receiver for one more guy here, and it's an obvious one we got to talk about. That's Calvin Ridley. And as much as I do not think they should let him hit free agency just because of how much you stand to lose, and that you pretty much would establish that that trade is a loss for the Jaguars, I think he is going to hit free agency. The reason why I say that is because there's another player on this team who is primed to get the franchise tag. And we'll talk about him in a second. Y'all know who it is. I'll still save it for the conversation later. But the franchise tag is not going to be available for Calvin Ridley, the way they're handling things. They're not going to get the other deal done. It's a more important deal. And so Ridley is going to hold all the cards because this is a guy who's going to turn 30 this year. He has not earned a significant amount during his career other than a fifth-year option, which was probably half of what he should have been earning for the production he has as a receiver. So he's going to demand a lot on the market. And there's going to be teams out there who are going to pay him a lot on the market. And do we think Jacksonville is going to win that negotiation? I don't know. I don't think they will, personally. But he's going to hit the market because there's nothing that Jacksonville can really do except throw the bag at him that's going to keep him here. I just don't think there's that level of commitment to him or from him to the team because, I mean, I don't blame him, honestly, but he's got to earn money at this point in his career. He's got to start getting some. He missed out on a year and a half of time. It drove down his market, and now he's finally getting this opportunity. This is what's right for him. This is what he's got to do. So I don't think he's going to have a contract with Jacksonville when the new league year starts. So that's probably going to be the case. And just to kind of justify as well why I think the Jaguars aren't going to pursue this too hard before free agency begins, one of the things that stood out to me when they talk about him is the language they use and how they talked a couple years ago about DJ Chark, for example. Both these guys, generally what they said, and you can go look up the quotes for yourselves, they're also on my Twitter page. They talked about both of them like players that they thought were good, they thought they could do a lot for the team, they wanted to have them back, but they were non-committal. They made it very clear that they don't know if that's going to be the case. They set the expectation that it might not happen. And they've done that very clearly with Calvin Ridley. They are preparing the fans for a world where he is not on the team. Doesn't mean that has to be the way things go, but I think there's a pretty high likelihood that he does actually end up walking and going to another team because of that. So that's a major problem in the idea of him returning. I just don't think that there's the huge focus on it right now, and I don't think they're as committed as what we expect them to be. And then there's also the unknowns of the scenarios around what gives up a second round pick, what gives up a third round pick. I mean, we just don't know right now. And so the two ideas that I've heard, one has been around for a while, the other one has come around recently. The two ideas are that, one, you have to wait until the new league year starts. And then if you sign him after, then you give up the third because he's not under contract when the new year starts, which is apparently when the pick would process as far as like which one are we giving up. The other idea, which it might be both of these, is that you could also avoid it by doing the franchise tag. Because I believe it was for Leonard Williams when he went to the New York Giants, there was a similar scenario here where the Giants kept him around on a franchise tag, but they didn't give up the bigger pick because they didn't count that as an extension, really. So it might be both of those scenarios. It might be one or the other. It might be none of them, for all we know. But that's a huge question as well in this. And obviously the team's going to know the language. They're going to know what they can do. We just don't as fans. And so there's a ton of things pointing to Calvin Ridley probably not being in Jacksonville next year and going to another team this offseason. So those are my thoughts on that. Two players I think that are going to be gone, going to be a big need at receiver for this team. Now, we'll go to a player I think will return for another year. That's Tyler Shatley. I don't think he's been like incredible for Jacksonville. I don't think he's a great starter or anything, but they've had him start quite a bit for this team when there's injuries. You look at his snap counts. I mean, I think the last 4 years, it's like he plays almost an entire season. Then he plays half, and then it's just a repeat of that. He's on the field a lot for Jacksonville starting because of injuries to this team, and also because Jacksonville really hasn't resolved the left guard situation until really the last half of this season. And we don't even know what's going to happen going forward with that, which we'll talk about in a second. But I look at Tyler Shatley, it's a guy they've had around for like 10 years now. He's a cheap veteran. He's very affordable. And you know he can start. You know he's not going to get injured a ton. It makes a lot of sense for them to bring him back. Clearly, there's the value there of them. They like him as a player. There's nothing keeping you from doing this because, if anything, he might be cheaper now that he's like, I think, 33 years old. So, there's that. There's also the chance he could end up retiring. Although I think if that was the case, we would probably know by now. So I do think Shatley ends up at least coming back for another year. That's why in this scenario, I predict him to earn $2 million for 2024, and then we'll see from there. So that's my thoughts on Shatley. We'll get to the final offensive guy here, which is Ezra Cleveland. As much as I like Ezra Cleveland, and for you guys that followed me for a while, he was a player I wanted to come to Jacksonville. He was one of my top trade deadline targets, and he did end up coming here. It was pretty shocking to me. I didn't expect it at all. And he felt like a clear fit, because he's worked with Phil Rauscher before. I think Phil Rauscher was the OO coach in Minnesota when Cleveland was drafted. So these are two guys that know each other really well, and Cleveland fits the offense really well too. So all these things match up, right? Sounds like a player who's probably going to do really well here, stick around past the year. But then you look at how last year went, and it just wasn't good. I mean, he didn't grade out well with Jacksonville. He did really good in Minnesota when he was starting. But with Jacksonville, he struggled. And you could blame that on a lot of things. I think one, obviously, is the fact that he came to a new team in the middle of the season. There's also the fact that the team really took a downturn around that point. And then he's also playing with Luke Fortner to his right. So we kind of talked about this last video with like Brandon Scherf, where it may be a better player than what you're seeing on the field, but he's got to worry about assignments for the guy next to him too, because that guy is just lost. He's not playing well. And we've hit on Fortner enough. I don't need to go into my rant again, but that really hurt Ezra Cleveland, I think, when he came here. And so this is a player that I think other teams are going to look at as a good starter. They're going to look at what he did in Minnesota. I think they're going to be able to kind of write off what happened in Jacksonville. And so the only way I think he comes back is if you can convince him to sign a cheap prove-it deal, which I don't think he has to. I think he can go somewhere else and earn a significant contract because I think he's that good of a player. And I think where he goes, he is probably going to play much better for them. So realistically, I think Ezra Cleveland does hit the market for Jacksonville, and he ends up going to another team because of that. But at the same time, it's not going to shock me if they have a lot of interest in keeping him because this is a good football player. I think he is a starter in the NFL. It's just a situation that was not good for him, and it just all added up, and he just didn't persevere in that. So we'll see what happens, but that's my expectation with Ezra Cleveland. So to wrap up the offensive side of the ball, we have a few guys returning. Those would be Dearness Johnson, Tim Jones, and then Tyler Shatley. And then we have Jamal Agnew, Calvin Ridley, and Ezra Cleveland hitting the market. Now to go to the defense. We'll start with a pretty easy one here. K'Lavon Chaisson. The Jaguars have talked about him like a player they see value in. They've talked about how they think he's a good special teamer and all these things. and that he has a long career ahead of him. They quite frankly said that. And I hope he does for his sake. I mean, he was a guy I liked coming into the draft. Obviously, my take was very wrong on that. But I don't know how the team who drafts him in the first round ends up coming to terms with him on a deal after that when he clearly did not live up to expectations. And he didn't come close. I mean, we're not talking about a guy that looked more like a second or a third round pick. We're talking about a guy that looked more like a sixth rounder, a seventh rounder of the draft. So you don't really see that happen a whole lot, especially because for Calvin, I think there's other teams out there. I mean, I might sound crazy here, but there's other teams that, they've got pride, they've got confidence in themselves. They see that kind of player hit the market and they say, I can fix that. I can make that guy good. They didn't know what they were doing. I mean, look at Taven Bryan. Went to a couple teams. I think he signed like pretty decent deals as well. But this was a guy that we trashed, didn't think was that good at all, and teams still took a shot on him. I think that's going to happen with Chaisson. So I think those teams are going to offer a little more than what Jacksonville is for him to be a special teamer for them, which is really what he is. He's not much more than that, although they tried to force him out of the field. So realistically, I don't think he comes back to Jacksonville. That's a really hard one to project happening. Just because of, I think, the history with that and players who underperform usually not getting signed back to the team when it's this drastic of an underperformance. So next guy, we're going to keep it on the defensive line for a couple more people here. We're going to talk about Dawuane Smoot. So this is one that kind of sucks because with Dawuane Smoot, I think he's a good football player. He was clearly having a breakout year in 2022, but he suffered a terrible injury, an injury that has derailed a lot of careers, and he recovered from it. But when he came back to the field, I think he had like one huge play in the first game he came back. And after that, it's just kind of dead silence. Didn't really do much for Jacksonville. Didn't look like the same guy. And this is a player that, we almost didn't keep him this year. The Baltimore Ravens tried to take him away from Jacksonville. So you go into the next year and you're the team that didn't get your money's worth out of him. I think someone else takes the chance and is willing to pay him more than what you did. So it's very likely that they're probably not going to be the top option for Dawuane Smoot. And they're probably going to have to focus on another player in free agency because they will probably have to consider adding another pass rusher to go behind Josh Allen, Trayvon Walker, because that room is really barren in this scenario. So those are my thoughts on Dawuane Smoot. Probably going to hit the market. I think he could be much better in 2024, but it's hard to predict that, especially when you're the team that just paid him when he didn't have a good year. So let's talk about the big one, and maybe call Calvin Ridley the big one if you want, but this is the other big one. It's Josh Allen. This isn't what I'd do, but this is what they're going to do. It is clear as day right now. It's been clear for, probably 3 or 4 weeks at this point that Josh Allen is going to get a franchise tag from Jacksonville. There's been almost no talk of an extension at this point. I can't understand that for the life of me, how your top priority, you won't even sit down at the table with him to discuss the contract, but this is where we are. They clearly are not close at this point. They're not going to get a deal done before the franchise tag deadline. And to spell out what happens if you don't franchise tag him in that scenario, well, Josh Allen gets paid a crap ton of money by another team, and you get a third-round compensatory pick. And you look like an idiot in that scenario. That's the other part of it. That's probably the biggest part of it. So it's not an option. He has to be franchise tagged, and they understand that. They made that very clear at the press conference that Josh Allen is going to be a Jaguar. And that's exactly what they mean by it, is that if there is not a long-term deal signed before the franchise tag deadline, which there will not, Josh Allen will get the tag placed on him. So don't be shocked when you see this. He's going to be a Jaguar. It's just probably not going to be in a pretty way, which we're going to have to live with. So this is kind of an obvious one for me, but it's not a decision I like because of what it does with Calvin Ridley, because then you're handing all the cards to him. You know, whether or not you see Calvin Ridley as a long-term piece on this team, you would so much rather figure out the extension with Josh Allen now, have that done in time, be able to tag Calvin Ridley. If you want to keep him, you can, but you could also go out and trade him off to another team, because another team will pay the salary that he gets on the franchise tag for him to play for their team. That will happen. That's what I would do. But I don't think that's what Jacksonville is going to do, because this is a situation they are willingly putting themselves in. So, my thoughts on Josh Allen. Now, we'll get to some smaller players. It's really what we're going to talk about for the rest of this, because as we get towards like the linebackers and secondary, there's not really a bunch of big names that we're talking about bringing back. It's a lot of players that, you know, might be starters, more average guys, or more so backups. So the first guy here, Shaquille Quarterman, backup for the team, but, you know, he is a hard worker. He's someone who wants to be here. He had the huge play against Derrick Henry, which I think will be a factor at the end of the day. Not something that's going to change the money a bunch, but, you know, it shows you the kind of player that he is. He wants to make an impact when he's on the field. He's just not a starter. And so when you're talking about what he's going to earn, I think it's going to be near veteran minimum. And so I see this as the guy who can be a good special teamer, who can come in and start if you absolutely need him to. And he's going to give it his all. You pay him the veteran minimum. There's a spot for him on the team. You sort that out, and you're done with it. Because I don't think Shaq really wants to go somewhere else. And I don't think there's a reason why Jacksonville would not be willing to do something like this. So I think this gets worked out whether or not, you know, this happens after free agency starts. He'll probably be in Jacksonville after free agency ends. So those are my thoughts on Shaq. Kind of a simple one there. Got another simple one here too. Gregory Junior. It's another ERFA option. So we're talking about less than $1 million. You got to think about these basically like this is a rookie player still. Rookie contract player, that is. So he's going into his third year. Played really well in the preseason. Obviously, that doesn't mean everything, but it shows that he is improving as a player. And I think he has the upside to be a starter in the slot. So at the bare minimum, I think you look at him like a backup at that position, and then you go get a new starter if you don't have Tre Herndon back, which we'll talk about in a second. And so Gregory Junior is easily justifiable for the team. There's just really not a reason to say no. And heck, by now they might have already said they want to keep him, for all I know. So Gregory Junior, he's going to be back with the team. Another really simple one there. Now talking about Tre Herndon. I think Tre Herndon is going to go somewhere else. I don't expect him to be back. Last year, whether fans remember it or not, he almost went to San Francisco. There were other competitors that were also interested in him. There's a bit of a market because he is a solid starter in the slot. I don't think he's like a high upside guy, but this is a player who has gotten better every year of his career. And from what we originally saw him as when he stepped in for Jalen Ramsey, much different player now. And so I respect him for that, for improving his game this much over the course of half a decade. And I think for Jacksonville, they obviously need to upgrade, right? And they're going to have changes in the secondary because the coverage scheme is going to flip a lot. We're not going to be running as much zone. I don't think Tre Herndon is the best fit for that. So I think Jacksonville is going to go out, try to find another starter, let Herndon walk. He's going to earn a little bit more than what he did with Jacksonville last year, I think. Probably 3 to 4 million. And that's probably how this is all going to shake out. So Tre Herndon is one starter. I do expect the Jaguars to lose in free agency because I just don't think it's really the top option for them in their plans. So I got two more guys we're going to talk about. One more of a special teamer, and we're going to talk about our kicker. So the first guy, Daniel Thomas, he is a valued special teamer in Jacksonville. I think the Jaguars have shown that they definitely respect the value of special teamers. They showed that last year when they said they wanted to draft for it, which I still think was stupid, but they still did it, and they've made it pretty clear how they feel about these guys. So you got a leader in that unit, that's coming on to his second contract. I think they're going to keep him around, get something worked out. Probably not going to be a huge deal. So here it's like 1.75 million a year, a little under 2 million. I think they lock him up for a few years. So it's kind of similar to like Andrew Wingard's contract, but you're not factoring in, having maybe as much of an impact or being as much of a locker room leader. Not that Daniel Thomas can't be a leader, but Andrew Wingard is the heart and soul of the Jaguars at many times throughout the years. So that's kind of your difference, but I see them in the same way that these are special teamers that the Jaguars want to keep around for quite a while. So, final guy here, Brandon McManus. I think he's going to walk. I think it's kind of clear already. They signed Riley Patterson to a futures contract, so he is going to be competing for the starting job next year. You don't bring in competition for a guy that you're paying well over the veteran minimum. And Brandon McManus is not signing for the veteran minimum. Another team will pay him what we did to bring him in. And they will ignore what happened in certain games this year, where Brandon McManus was really good most of the year, but he still had multiple performances where he did not play well for Jacksonville. So I just don't think they're sold on that. Everything they're doing kind of points to going in their direction. They'll probably have Riley Patterson, and then they'll probably bring in maybe another guy, draft someone, or sign a UDFA. I just think the route is going to fall somewhere else than bringing back McManus as a starter next year. So those are all our players. These are all our extensions. This really wraps up things other than our actual free agent signings we'll talk about. And then we'll try to talk about some trades that might be possible for Jacksonville. Your total cap space, it really doesn't go down as much as you'd expect with Josh Allen getting the franchise tag here. So the value of that, by the way, just shy of $22 million. So you're sitting with this team over $20 million in cap space. You've got room to restructure players if you need to. When you're looking at that, you're looking at guys who have multiple years left of their contracts, players that have a high base salary, because that's the money you can convert to signing bonus. So players we look at, might be a Christian Kirk, could be Foye Oluokun if they extend him. I think that's very much possible. So those are guys that we probably talk about as the top options for that. So I think it's likely they could save even more money. And when they probably agree to some kind of deal with Josh Allen, close to the season starting, that's going to save a ton too, because you go from that $22 million cap hit down to maybe 6 or 7. So more money can be made available very easily. But this is definitely something to start with, especially when you consider that you're going to be backloading the deals that you sign new players to. So, kind of give you my thoughts on this situation. I think a lot of it, if they do this, and I do expect them to go close to this route, I think a lot of it is good because I want to see this team get off big contracts. I want to see them reset. The thing that I obviously don't like is the approach with Josh Allen and Calvin Ridley, which I think is very clear it's going to go that way at this point. For me, I'd want to either keep them both or get the value you can out of Calvin Ridley for this team. And I want to keep Josh Allen happy because this is the guy that you need to succeed. So the approach, I'm not far off from it other than that part of it. I think a lot of it makes sense. And then you could see other moves potentially, like we talked about before, with maybe a Darius Williams getting traded. I think teams will have a lot of interest in him. He is a very good football player still. This would be the prime time to trade him if you want to get something out of him after 2 really good years in Jacksonville. So those are my thoughts for you guys. That's everything for extensions. I appreciate you watching. I'll probably take a little bit before doing a trades video because I do want to get a little closer to the free agency period. And then we'll talk as well at that point about what players could probably head to Jacksonville too. So thank you for watching. Thank you for spending your time here. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day. And finally, go Jags.